Hi there, we're continuing on with our video series today, and I want to talk about a very important topic that's becoming more and more prevalent in our business and operating climate these days. And I'm really pleased about that because I think as we go through this section, you're going to see how really important the industrial ecosystem has become and will become in the years to follow. What is it? Well, in the industrial ecosystem, nothing is ever considered to be waste. Everything in one way or another feeds something else and is recycled or reused. In effect, what we're doing is creating co-resources and multiple sources of revenue in addition to the primary resource or the primary product. And so what we see is that, yes, we're producing X, but what ends up happening is we have Y and Z and whatever other letters that you want to use, which are in fact the byproducts that are created from the industrial process. Now, as I'm sure many of us are aware, throughout the Industrial Revolution, there was many different ways of handling those byproducts, and often, unfortunately, they went directly right into the ecosystem, the real ecosystem, the rivers, the lakes, the streams, the soil. All of this absorbed for centuries, in fact, the waste from the industrial process. But companies are becoming a lot smarter, are becoming a lot more efficient, and also realizing that by incorporating byproduct revenue, that co-resource revenue, into your full bottom line, this is really giving us an exciting opportunity to look at expanding what our sources of revenue are and also doing something really good for our communities and for the planet. When we have an environmental focus like you do in the industrial ecosystem, it has a direct impact on what we call the real bottom line. And the real bottom line must involve a concern for the environment, as well as very significantly a response to the community at large and to all the stakeholders. The industrial ecosystem is going to help to ensure that the cycle of industrial process is not broken by relying on the traditional grids of power and energy. Now, what's also very important about the industrial ecosystem for it really to have a direct impact is that it provides a contribution to the community. Obviously, in many scenarios, the factory has existed or the operations have existed in terms of natural resource extraction, so people have become accustomed to that, and obviously there's jobs and employment and economy that goes along with those operations. But what we find in the industrial ecosystem as we begin to rethink some of these processes and perhaps automate them and bring them into different ways of operating that are maybe not those traditional methods, there may in fact be some replacement of jobs or some shifting of jobs. Well, what's important is that we show that in developing the industrial ecosystem where we have other byproducts and different sources of revenue, that in fact those can be where we transfer some of that knowledge over into the development and evolution of the product or the resource. Now, what we find too is that there must be a bit of a cautious approach to these byproducts, because when we look at just completely exporting them or sending them somewhere else and they don't directly impact on the immediate ecosystem in terms of the community or where we're operating, that can have its own concerns regarding ultimate footprint in terms of what's the energy being used to take that to market. Is there markets for it locally instead of just always looking perhaps for an export opportunity? But these are the things these are the growing pains, but they're the exciting opportunities that exist when we discuss the industrial ecosystem. And one of the main things that's happening is that companies are often looking for opportunities to feed back power and energy into the existing infrastructure, the grid, and you're selling power back to the grid, or in fact what you're doing is you're replacing the grid power that you would typically be using. You're replacing that with now energy that you're getting from what we would typically have called waste sources. Where fuel, where gas, where power are being, in a sense, wasted, we're able to now recapture some of that and turn that back into the process. And part of turning that back into the process is using that new energy, that excess energy, to be able to run some of these new industrial processes that are coming off of our primary operations. And a really important opportunity for companies, organizations, and communities as we evolve and start to take a look at the industrial ecosystem is to really look closely at partnerships with the government to enhance infrastructure in a certain area. If we can help to benefit the community by providing extra resources or energy or power through responsible management of the industrial ecosystem process, this is a huge opportunity for industry and government and community to partner together. So I have an example of a way to look at the industrial ecosystem as a whole. And this is an example of wastewater treatment, which in pretty well every city and town and municipality has a wastewater treatment plant. And often individual companies and organizations also have their own wastewater treatment plant. So I'm going to point out a tangible physical example. We're going to get out in the weeds a little bit here and go off into a video that really explains the whole process. And for those of you that may not want to get out in the weeds, you can advance to the next video, but the rest of us, we're going to focus on this because this is a really key example that shows exactly how the industrial ecosystem works. Okay, so what we have first is the concept of waste, which we are going to turn into a resource treatment and recovery process. In example, the industrial ecosystem. Okay, so what we have right now is a community. And what's happened to that community is it's being impacted by industrial wastewater and or natural wastewater, which is impacted, and the inlet for that community becomes contaminated. Now, we've heard many unfortunate examples of this. Obviously, there's places around the world, but we know here in Canada and also Flint, Michigan, for example, this is a huge example of how a community has been impacted by their inlet water being contaminated. So this is where we start the process. So the inlet water, which is contaminated, flows into the community, and then also we have to understand that the community has to function, and so the wastewater is now flowing back in, and now we have an unfortunate cycle of inlet water, which is in fact completely contaminated. We call this an impacted community. Okay, now we integrate a wastewater treatment process. And that can be nanotechnology, it can be osmosis, there can be all these different kinds of mechanical or chemical, biological processes for treating water. But the main thing is we have to make sure that the waste that's coming off of the water treatment process is in fact something that can be used. Well, now you can see that the line, instead of going in and out of the community with this toxic inlet, contaminated water, flows into the treatment system and flows out of the treatment system now and can be turned into clean water, which has been processed and treated. It can be used for industrial reuse, so you can actually incorporate that water back into your operations and use that for operating your facilities. Or it can be used now for agriculture. It could be put into ponds used for cattle, for ranching, for growing crops. This is a way that now you're taking the wastewater, treating it, and now these are these processes. Now let's look at these. These are clean water processes, but it has not been converted into water yet for human consumption. But right there, we've now created a source of water off of wastewater that previously would have just been dumped or not really worried about. And now you can see the outlet water, so we have the inlet water, which is treated. Now we have the outlet water, which is treated, and that becomes a byproduct of the resource extraction from the wastewater treatment. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the wastewater. Now here we have an issue of creating something from the solid waste. And the solid waste, this is why I said very importantly, you have to make sure in your wastewater treatment process that you have effective treating that takes the solid waste out of the water, and now that's a byproduct. Now, depending on the constituency of that solid waste, it can be used for fertilizer, it can be used for cement or aggregate products. There's all kinds of different uses now for the solid waste. So what have we got off the one process? A wastewater treatment plant. We have clean water that can be reused. Now we have solid waste that can be converted into another source of revenue or a product for reuse. And now we're going to build the infrastructure. And so once the treatment plant's in there, now we put in our pipelines, we create our infrastructure, and now we have a way of transporting clean water where before we were only having to worry about this dirty water. That's all come about because we've created a process for taking in the wastewater, treating the wastewater, and now looking at the byproducts. Now, we want to drink this water. Okay, that's fine. We now need to add in a desalination process if the water is high in salinity. And we also have to potentially, if we're using it for drinking water, putting in an antibacterial treatment to make sure that there's no bad stuff, like in the case of Flint. And so these are not complex processes. They are in a sense, but at the very heart of it, what is the baseline for this is to turn it into a process that works. And so we're potentially creating salt, which is a resource. There it is. We've created solid waste, which we're able to use as a byproduct. We've created clean water, and now we have an opportunity to feed clean water back into the community. You're going to use a main pump, and then that's going to supply basic small transfer pumps, which is going to take the water from the main pump, and it's going to drive that water into the community. And so there you can see how that works. It's a simple transfer pump process. Okay, well, we have an impacted community. Well, guess what? That now becomes an empowered community. Why? Because there's sources of revenue being able to be generated, or at the very least mitigating operating costs for your infrastructure, and you're not feeding the dirty water back and forth into the community. You're giving it clean water. And so now, what's going to happen? Well, there goes the hazardous part. There goes the toxicity. It's gone and it's left. So now, instead of turning waste into a problem, getting rid of it, having to landfill it, really this at the very heart of it is a resource treatment and recovery process that we like to call the industrial ecosystem. Do you see how we just turn garbage into junk? You've heard of the saying, one man's junk is another man's treasure. Well, in this case, the junk and the waste becomes a treasure for all of us. It's a way for us to create revenue and evolve the industrial process into the 21st century and beyond, to see that we can create value from what we thought used to be junk and waste. Look forward to seeing you in the next videos. We're going to keep talking about ESG, acronym to action.